How will the upcoming ruling affect gun owners in the November election? Joining me now to discuss the case and its implications is Craig DeLuz of the National Center for Public Policy Research. Craig DeLuz, thank you so much for joining.
It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for having me.
Pleasure to have you, Craig. You're deeply involved in the political and Second Amendment discussions with the Firearms Policy Coalition, with the Supreme Court getting set to rule on Garland versus Cargill, which examines essentially the legality of a bump stock ban following the 1986 machine gun ruling. How might this decision impact the upcoming election?
Well, I think it's an interesting decision for this reason. You have, in this case, you have an administration that's decided that they are going to take something that's defined in statute, and they're going to try to redefine it in order to ban a firearm or a firearm part that they don't like. Now, when it comes to, for example, bump stocks, not a lot of people own bump stocks. Not a lot of people are interested in owning bump stocks. But so a lot of people decided, well, we're not even going to really pay attention to that. The problem with that is that what happens when you have an administration come along who starts to then say, well, I'm going to redefine firearms or firearm parts that people do like, right? We've already allowed them to violate the separation of powers by trying to legislate from the executive branch. Believe it or not, the ATF does not get to make the law. They get to enforce the law. And I think that's probably the biggest part of what we're going to be seeing in this decision is it's not just about the Second Amendment. It's a direct attack on the Second Amendment, but it's really also about protecting the rest of the Constitution and separation of powers. And I believe that this Supreme Court in particular recognizes the overreach that many in the executive branch at all levels of government, sadly, have undertaken.
Yeah, I think it's somewhat understated how important the Second Amendment is to many Americans, even those in your home state of California, that people typically think is, a blue state and with so many gun restrictions. There's actually a lot of people in California even that are paying attention to this. During February's oral arguments on bump stocks, the justices did seem somewhat split, especially concerning those who acquired them legally. Justice Gorsuch highlighted concerns about potentially criminalizing 250,000 to 500,000 owners. What could be the implications of this court's decision either way?
The implication is going to be whether, number one, whether or not executive offices or executive departments have the ability to basically legislate from their departments. Part of it is going to be that. The other part is going to be whether or not it is going to further the folks who don't support the Second Amendment in their belief that, okay, so you have a right to keep and bear arms, you have the right to own a gun, but you don't have a right to the firearm parts that you want. You don't have a right to the gun that you want. You don't have a right to build your own firearm. You don't have the right to sell firearms. All of these things are now in question, and they're realizing that they can't take away the Second Amendment, but they can nibble away at all of the things around the Second Amendment such that it becomes too cumbersome or too expensive to be able to exercise that right.
Craig, you mentioned the ATF doesn't get to make the law, they can enforce it, and that's what they should do. Given the contentious nature of this Supreme Court case, do you think there will be increased pressure on Congress to revisit legislation limiting the Second Amendment?
There's always pressure on Congress to revisit the Second Amendment. The challenge is most of the people who are applying that pressure and most of the folks in Congress have little to no understanding of firearms or firearms technology. So oftentimes what happens is when they start to push quote unquote solutions, those solutions don't actually solve the problem. And that's also, quite frankly, been the issue in the courts. Is in many cases, you have judges adjudicating over some of these court cases, and they have very little understanding of, once again, of firearm technology. For example, what is the definition of a quote-unquote of a gun? What is, in this case, a machine gun when we're talking about bump stocks? And when you look at the actual technology, you find out that in many cases the things that they are offering as solutions are not solutions. it's smoke and mirrors. It's this I've got to do something mentality. And I always go back on that. I always say, well, you know what? My car won't start. So I need to rotate the tires because, I got to do something.
Craig DeLuz, important discussion. Thank you so much for joining.
Thank you for having me.